Hi, thanks for coming to watch the video on how do electromagnetic fields, EMFs, affect us. When I started doing this, I thought it would be quite a quick video, and as I started putting the PowerPoint together, I suddenly realized there was a lot more to this than I'd originally thought or originally planned. And there are quite a few aspects to this that I could probably do separate videos on. So it's not exhaustive. It'll touch on quite a few different areas, and hopefully just give you the idea that when you hear the telecommunications companies telling us that electromagnetic radiation is safe, that they're not entirely being truthful with us. So just a quick reminder on the electromagnetic spectrum again. So we start off with the extremely low frequency here on the left, going through very low frequency sort of TVs, and then we've got radio waves and television and beginning of mobile phones, microwaves and radar, and then going through the infrared spectrum to the visible light, which is quite narrow, ultraviolet and X-rays, gamma rays, and these are the ionizing rays at the at this high frequency short wavelength end of the spectrum. And then we've got non-ionizing waves on the longer wavelength, lower frequency end of the spectrum over here. And so that's just a quick summary. So if we look at where some of the different technologies sit in the spectrum, so down below, as we said, we've got power lines 50 to 60 hertz, computers 60 to 100 hertz, radio, TV, mobile phones up to sort of 2.2 gigahertz, and we're now starting to get into higher gigahertz as 5G is being rolled out. It's sort of around 4 gigahertz. We've got smart meters and Wi-Fi around the 2.5 gigahertz area, and Wi-Fi also around the 6 gigahertz here. And Y-gig will be 60 gigahertz. Remote controls around 6 gig. And then we've got the microwave frequencies here, which is 3 to 300 gigahertz. And I've actually added into this one the terahertz and 6G, because although we're all talking about 5G now, 6G is already being developed in some countries, and it will be using terahertz frequencies. So that's if we survive long enough to get there. Anyway, let's start on how the EMFs affect us. So we have natural EMFs. Our body's adapted to recognize natural EMFs that are non-polarized and analogs. They're not pulsed, and we've got used to them through our evolution, and some of the natural EMFs, background EMFs, are Schumann resonance, and that's all linked into the ionosphere, the Van Allen belts, and the lower Schumann resonance actually is the same as our alpha brainwaves. So our behavior, alpha brainwaves, are what happens when we're in sleep, when we're calm. So when the Schumann resonances are sort of fairly dominant, then it will affect our brainwaves as well. We'll sort of end up in sync with the Schumann resonances. And then when we get bad weather and you get lightning strikes, and these affect these sort of tend to come in at the higher Schumann resonances, and they can cause delta waves in the brain, which have been found to adversely affect our behavior and how we feel. So we are completely in tune or in sync with what's going on in a much wider scale than we think, in terms of EMFs that are generated in our atmosphere and beyond. We also have, of course, in the Earth's magnetic background, because we've got this molten iron core to the Earth, which generates its own magnetic field. And these sort of frequencies, as I say, we've evolved in them, and we find them that they're beneficial to our health. So some of the techniques that you can often come across where people are starting to shield or try to shield for electromagnetic fields, the artificial ones, but they can also cut out these natural EMFs as well, which, as we've said here, they're beneficial to our health. So if we cut them out, then we can end up with health problems in the long term. It's not going to happen overnight, but if we don't have this influence sufficiently regularly, then it will start to affect our health adversely. But even naturally generated EMFs in excess can cause harm. So we think about ultraviolet from the sun, according to the power and exposure times, even over many years, we get sunburn, and if you stay in the sun too long, then you'll get burnt, and it can cause melanomas and all sorts of problems, and it's not good for our skin long term. And again, these things don't happen just through a short exposure. Prolonged overexposure over many years can cause problems too. Also, we get these magnetic storms, and they can increase cardiac problems. It's not something that people tend to be aware about very much, but certainly when we do get these natural phenomena of magnetic storms, there will be a higher instance of people going to hospital with cardiac problems. So, we are very much in tune with the planet. We also have, of course, our own indigenous EMFs that are fundamental to life. So, we communicate within our body using electromagnetic fields, electrical fields, lots of ions and everything else that are going on in the body. So, these are all fundamental to how we function. They set up the membrane potential, is the one where most people remember back to their school biology. Also, of course, nerves function very much on electrical principles. We get ion flows, which is the charged particles of all the different elements, and they distribute themselves across the membrane to give this membrane potential, and they change to give the nerve function. But we also have got ions as cofactors, so they're involved with some of the vitamins. We've also got iron within hemoglobin, which we use obviously for carrying oxygen around the body. So EMFs within our body are also fundamental to how we function too. Moving on to artificial EMFs. Artificially generated EMFs are polarized in one direction. So natural EMFs that we were talking about before are unpolarized, so all the fields are at multiple different directions. So the EMFs that are used for telecoms are modulated and incorporated into a carrier signal. These modulations are important, but often aren't replicated in EMF research, which will obviously skew the results. Digital EMFs have pulse modulation rather than smooth. And the previous video, when I talked about electromagnetic radiation itself, I went into this in a little bit more detail. So nature has not evolved, as we said, within or adapted to such EMFs. We've evolved in the non-polarized natural EMFs. So these are alien to us, and they adversely affect the body because we can't adapt to them. And it's impossible, especially with the digital signals. They're so unpredictable, and there's such a sharp rise and fall of the nature of the signal. The digital signals are we aren't going to be able to adapt to them over time even. They're just too sharp. So artificial EMFs have now increased over a very short period of time, and now 1 quintillion times more than natural background EMFs. 1 quintillion times sounds like a very large figure, and it is. It's a one with 18 zeros afterwards, and this rise has mostly happened in the last 10 years. So this is a little animation of using light as an example of EMFs and what happens with polarization. So we've got filters here that take this multi-directional light, and obviously it's gone through the filter, it comes out in one plane. In the blue one here, it's a vertical polarized light, and in the red one on the right, it is horizontally polarized. So polarization can happen in different planes. So Dr. Martin Paul, who's an emeritus professor at Washington State University, he has identified 8 main adverse effects of EMFs on the body. So he says primarily they attack the nervous system, including the brain, leading to widespread neurological and neuropsychiatric effects. They also attack the endocrine, the hormonal system. You see, the nervous system and the hormone system, these are really the main regulatory systems that control our homeostasis, control our function, and regulate how we respond to the world. So once these are being adversely affected, it's not difficult to see how many other diseases can arise. So one of the effects is you get oxidative stress, so free radical production and damage, which leads to chronic disease. This is also part and parcel with how DNA is adversely affected. It also acts as a fractal antenna, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But DNA is in cells. We know that DNA is our genetic coding. It determines for cell replication, and also how we produce enzymes and all sorts of proteins within the cells. So, it's essential to how we function. And the adverse effects, we get single strand and double strand breaks, which can lead to mutations, and obviously that can cause cancer as well. So we get increase in apoptosis, which is programmed cell death, which is especially important in causing neurodegenerative diseases and also infertility, both of which are on the rise. So we get lower male and female fertility, lower sex hormones, which feeds into this hormonal system disruption here, lower libido as a result, and increased levels of spontaneous miscarriage. And this is also will also be linked into the damage on DNA. So we get ion channel disruptions, which lead to doubling of the intracellular calcium and excessive calcium signaling. And Dr. Paul, he identified this and proved it when he gave cardiac pharmaceutical drugs, which called calcium blockers. So he stopped this influx of calcium into the cell with the calcium blockers, and the symptoms of the electromagnetic radiation disappeared for those people who had hypersensitivity to it. So this is how he proved that this is a disruption of calcium signaling, which is important for many biological functions throughout the body. So we've already spoken about how DNA can cause mutations and lead to cancer, but actually there's about 15 different mechanisms and pathways by which cancer can be increased, or the risk of cancers can be increased by EMFs. This is a slide taken from a talk by Dr. Martin Paul. If we see up here, we've got microwaves and lower frequency EMFs feeding into the voltage gated calcium channels, which are activated, which causes the calcium ion influx into the cell. And this combines with nitric oxide and superoxide to form peroxynitrite, which leads directly to pathophysiological effects itself. It also combines to form free radicals, oxidative stress, and inflammation, all of which contribute to these pathophysiological effects. The calcium ion influx also increases calcium signaling and alters that, which has direct effects into, or feedback into, pathological effects as well. So there's a number of different ways that that the EMFs here are feeding into causing disease situation. Now there is a pathway here going off to the right where we can actually get some benefits from electromagnetic radiation, but these are controlled. This is using a very specific worked out regime in order to get these therapeutic effects, and it's not something that happens by accident. when we just expose to multiple EMFs of multiple different frequencies. So this is some research that's been done over quite a few years. You can see this earliest date here is 1950, which showing how very low power density EMFs can have biological effects. And we see this low, I won't even try and read that figure, it's so low, but it can alter genetic structure of E. coli, which we know is a bacteria. So, we're getting bacteria being affected in their genetic coding, which can obviously potentially affect how they respond to antibiotics. So, we're getting effects in a microbiome as a result of very low power EMFs. The threshold of human sensitivity is very much lower than you'd think. Again, altered EEGs. EEGs, electroencephalograms, so that's brain activity is being altered again at very low power levels. And just an example, 100 yards from a cell phone is hundreds of times stronger than the power of the EMFs that would cause this altered brain activity in people. So it's also affecting the immune system. And somewhere between 100 yards from a cell phone and a mile from a cellular tower, the power level is sufficient to cause sleep disorders, abnormal blood pressure, nervousness, weakness, fatigue, limb pain, joint pain, digestive problems. School children had lower performance, and this was a controlled study which was carried out with a shortwave transmitter nearby. We also get cardiac changes, which is not surprising given that the heart works on electrical principles. So this is moving into ever higher power densities here. So we're getting reduced cell growth, childhood leukemia next to neurotransmitters. We're getting reduction in motor function and reaction times. Children are finding it more difficult to memorize their schoolwork and pay attention. And it's even changing the gender ratio in newborn children. So there's fewer boys. Here we go, 0.6, which is, as you say, many times stronger than some of the EMFs we saw on the previous screen. We're getting this change in calcium ion efflux that Dr. Martin Pohl identified. So we're getting changes in white blood cell activity in school children, which obviously white blood cells are all part of the immune system. And here we're getting higher levels of exposure, leading to headaches, dizziness, irritability, fatigue, weakness, insomnia, chest pains, difficulty in breathing, and indigestion. And you can see most of these researches have been done, all of these, in fact, on this page have been done before 2000. So this isn't new information that we're coming across. These are papers which have been studied and published over 20 years, and in some cases over 30 years. We're also getting a change in the blood-brain barrier, which keeps things that aren't supposed to go into our central nervous system in the brain, it stops them going in. So if we get this blood-brain barrier suddenly becomes more leaky, then all sorts of things like heavy metals can get into the brain. Again, as we go closer to TB and radio transmitters, leukemia, skin melanomas, bladder cancer, biochemical and histologicals, that's structural changes in the liver, heart, kidney, and brain. Damaged mitochondria. Mitochondria are the powerhouse of every cell in our body. This is how we generate energy for function. So anything that damages the mitochondria is going to have severe impacts on how we function overall as individuals. So we're getting, again, impaired memories, something we've seen slightly before already, and a redistribution of metals in the lungs, brain, heart, liver, kidneys, muscles, spleen, bone, skin, and blood. So basically pretty much all the organs there. And of course, metals, if they get into those organs, will tend to act a little bit like antennae themselves. So they'll draw in and attract the power from even more radiation. And if we look here at the FCC exposure limit, which is the American limit, and the UK and the EU is very close behind, this is 1,000 microwatts per centimetre squared. So all these effects that we've been talking about are very much lower, 100 times lower than the permitted exposure limits. Okay, if we look at some of the limitations that we get with research, it might try and explain why we're getting two different dialogues in terms of the safety of electromagnetic radiation on the body. Now, research is often carried out on cell lines, so single organ cells rather than the whole body. Obviously, we are a whole body, we're not just cell lines, but we need to know to a certain degree what will happen in those organs if exposed to the EMFs. So there is some validity to it, but obviously what we really need to know is what happens to us as a whole organism. A lot of the research is carried out with just a single frequency, which isn't relevant to real life because we're exposed to multiple frequencies altogether and multiple sources of the same frequencies. So there's no cumulative evaluation being done in much of the research which is being published, and very often the duration of the experiments is very short. It doesn't replicate the 24/7, 365 exposure that we have these days. And although 16 weeks of a rat exposure is equivalent to 1 year in human exposure, which was worked out by the Ramazzini Institute in Italy, it's a long exposure, even for the rats to replicate what the effects are going to be for us year on year of exposure to all these different frequencies and different power levels as well. Very often in the research, the frequencies aren't modulated. So again, this isn't very representative of the EMFs that were hitting us from telecommunications. So these unmodulated frequencies are very much more predictable, and they remove informational effective EMFs that I'll talk about later from the research. So as I was saying, not representative of real life situation. So because the frequencies aren't being modulated, there's no carrier signal being used either. And this carrier signal can have its own effects, and also with the frequencies that it's carrying, there could be a cumulative effect of both together, which again isn't being addressed in the research. Of course, we don't just exist in EMFs without any other influences on the body as well. So we have other additional stressors which we are exposed to, and yet the EMFs, as well as having their own effect on the body, can also impact how these other additional stressors can have effects on us too, and the two together often will have a synergistic effect, i.e. the sum of each individually it isn't the same as having both together, which we get a much stronger effect. For example, heavy metals, nanoparticles, pollutants and solvents, etc., where the EMFs allow these to have a much greater effect on the body. And of course, as not surprising, there's industry bias. So the telecoms companies don't want to admit that there's a danger. They tend to fund research, which they try to direct, and they'll try to suppress results that aren't showing them in a good light. So very similar to what went on with the tobacco industry in the past. The difference is now, not in the past with the tobacco industry, not everybody smoked, but actually we're all being exposed to the EMF, whether we like it or not. We don't have a choice. And this research bias was identified and heavily criticised by an Italian judge, actually two Italian judges, in a recent case The first bit was 3 years ago, but then it was upheld in the Turing Court of Appeal earlier this year, 2020. So this is what I mean when I'm talking about telecom signals modulation. So we've got the frequency that is being used for the telecoms. We've also got this carrier signal, and when we add them together, this is what happens. You get a modulated result. So depending on whether you're using amplitude modulation, frequency modulation, or digital modulation, will determine which of these combined signals across the bottom you get. And as I was saying in the just now in the research, this carrier wave isn't being used within the signal. We're just getting these frequencies which aren't being modulated. And so the experiments aren't really representative of what we're being exposed to in real life. Okay, so let's talk about body penetration by EMFs, because obviously that's important to know how different electromagnetic fields and radiation is going to affect us. You know, how deep it goes into the body will have an impact, or so you might think. So longer wavelengths, lower frequencies, they can travel further between the broadcasting and receiving, but they will also penetrate deeper into the body. So the magnetic field goes deeper into the body than the electrical field, and the EMFs penetrate proportionally deeper in smaller bodies. So if you've got, by this I mean, if you've got a field or a frequency that, for example, penetrates 5 centimeters into the body, 5 centimeters into an adult is still fairly superficial. In a baby or a small child, that 5 centimeters into the body might actually be sufficient from all directions to effectively affect the whole body. And of course, we're not just talking about children here, we're also talking about our pets and animals as well. All smaller bodies the EMFs will proportionally penetrate deeper than they do in an adult human, which is where virtually all this assessment of EMFs is carried out. So children will absorb up to 10 times more radiation than adults, and are more susceptible because DNA is more active in growing individuals. They've got more stem cells. The DNA, as they grow, is dividing, and as we've seen, one of the ways in which EMFs affect the body is to cause damage to the DNA. So if DNA is more active, it is potentially more likely to become damaged, and therefore that's why children are more susceptible. So higher frequencies will carry more information per unit of time. So it's this much higher modulation that you then see with the telecommunications, and that has a greater effect on the body as well. So it also explains why when the signals aren't being modulated for research, why we're not getting in some of the research the replication of some of the dangers and damages which are being experienced in the population. As we were saying, most focus goes on the modulation frequency for getting the carrier. So although the modulation frequency might be quite high frequency, the carrier will be a lower frequency and will itself penetrate deeper into the body. The other aspect we need to consider is due to resonant frequency effects, there are windows of influence. So as I explained in the previous video on EMFs themselves, different voltage gates and different ions have their own frequencies, and so EMFs coming in very similar to those frequencies or at those frequencies will have a much higher effect than EMFs coming in between those frequencies. So you don't get a smooth curve or of effect, you get windows of influence. So it's not as straightforward as it might be made out to be. Okay, we're coming a little bit more onto the 5G now, and to the microwave frequencies, and we're told that they're safe because they only affect the skin. And we're going to go into this a little bit more detail because, as you'll see, this is totally not true. But going back a little bit, this is what I mean if you can imagine, this is skull penetration according to age of a mobile phone signal. And of course, an adult's head is much bigger. So if that distance from the mobile phone to where the yellow ends deeper in the brain is a set distance, and yet if you think of a 10-year-old's head being smaller, that you can see how much deeper, how much further across into the brain the signal goes from the mobile phone. And if you're looking at a 5-year-old or even a baby, you can see that it's got a smaller skull still, and so that signal goes the same distance into the brain, but actually now goes right across to the other side of the skull. So this is what I was alluding to, and I was saying that you get proportionally more penetration of EMFs into smaller bodies and skulls. Okay, so EMFs preferentially affect different structures. So humans are approximately 70% water by volume, but 90% water by molecule numbers. And children tend to be more hydrated, which is one of the reasons why they can become more affected by EMFs, because EMFs affect the water. And the reason why is because by virtue of water being polarized, it is influenced by both magnetic and electrical fields. So if you can see films on YouTube where drops or stream of water can be changed direction by putting a magnetic or electrical field across it, and because it's polarized, the water will change its course. Now, of course, there's another aspect to water in the body, which is called fourth phase water, which was discovered by Professor Jerry Pollack of Washington State University. And what he discovered was that you get sort of semi-structured water by hydrophilic surfaces, which are exactly what happens by cell membranes. And this fourth phase water has certain properties which have beneficial effects within the body, including hemodynamics. So EMFs, by virtue of affecting the polarization of the water, can reduce the fourth phase water in the cells, and these knock-on effects in other ways. So organs with a higher water content are also more highly influenced by electromagnetic fields, including the brain, testes, kidneys, eyes, skin, blood. Obviously, closer to the surface will be more easily accessible by the higher frequency EMFs as well. So the brain has got very high water content, and we know from Dr. Pahl's 8 influences of EMFs, the central nervous system is highly affected by EMFs. We also know male fertility, especially, is having a problem at the moment. The testes is obviously very close to the surface, high water content. We know that EMFs affect DNA and cause DNA damage. So we're getting a reduction in infertility here, and also interference with the hormones too. Kidneys likewise are fairly close to the surface, a high water content, because obviously they're filtering the blood and producing urine. Eyes obviously very close to the surface too. Cataracts are quite common with EMFs for prolonged effects or the wrong power levels of EMFs. Skin covers the body, so it is obviously going to be the first barrier to electromagnetic fields, and it's got quite a high water content, or should have quite a high water content as well. And blood, as it circulates close to the surface, will be influenced by the EMFs. So and also will carry those EMF effects deeper into the body as well. So membrane function is highly influenced due to ion channels. We've already heard of Dr. Pahl and his discovery that calcium channels especially are influenced by EMFs, although they're not the only ion channels in the cell wall, and they aren't the only ion channels which are adversely affected either. calcium happens to be one of the main ions in terms of its biological influence, which is why a lot of symptoms are mediated through that channel. Also, proteins are charged. You get charge distribution and different areas within the proteins which have got certain charges on them, and that will affect how they fold as well. So, you know, EMFs can affect the structure of proteins, and the structure of proteins will then determine their functionality too, especially for something like an enzyme. So we get membranes obviously in cells, but we also get quite high membrane area in mitochondria, and mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. It's where a lot of energy metabolism takes place. So if we're getting membranes disrupted by EMFs, which is also disrupting especially processes where you're involving movement of electrons, so ATP, NADH, and all those sorts of biochemical pathways, then not only the mitochondria themselves being affected, but also the functions going on within mitochondria too. So DNA is highly susceptible due to the structural water which maintains the helix that was discovered by Watson and Crick. Van der Waals bonds between the water molecules and the DNA itself is what creates and maintains that helical structure. And DNA, obviously, because it's got that helical structure, is very much shorter in the cell as a result of being wound up. But it also, because of its length, and also with the shorter wavelengths and the harmonics of longer wavelengths, it acts as an antenna. So when the DNA is attracting the power, it sets up a current along the DNA. And when you get bottlenecks in current through the DNA is when you get build-up of energy, and that's when the DNA is likely to get damaged there, which is where you get the single and double strand breaks, which create all the knock-on effects from DNA damage. So the effect is determined by frequency, modulation, and exposure time. So there's a number of different factors here, and exposure time is, as we've already talked about from the research, it's one of those things that isn't really being replicated in experiments very well, because we're now being exposed to extreme levels of EMF exposure, 1 quintillion times more than natural background EMFs, but we're also being exposed to them 24/7, 365. So there is no respite whatsoever. So, the exposure time is really important. And it's a little bit like if you think back to the old camera films where you had the silver ions on the film. Obviously, if you've got the right film and the right shutter speed, you'll get a great picture. But also, you can use a different film and different exposure time to get a similar sort of picture too. And likewise, if the exposure is too long, then the film will get enlarged and there'll be no picture there at all. And that's not dissimilar to what happens with EMFs and the body. If we're exposed to EMFs that we could otherwise cope with for a relatively short periods of time, but if those exposure times are protracted, then you will get the similar overexposure effect, which can cause all the damages and the influences that we've already spoken about. So a good example of this was a research done where they looked at the effects of a 7-hour long-haul flight, and they decided that the exposure to the cosmic rays and the radiation that occurs on airplane flights is equivalent to an X-ray in terms of exposure. So, people who are doing frequent long-haul flights and not considering their exposure to EMFs, it's not surprising if they get adverse effects, but probably don't recognize the result of where it's come from. So this slide is just an example, just looking at that whole mitochondria situation. When you get mitochondrial dysfunction, you can get all these different types of diseases. And some of these are very much on the increase. So Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, we're seeing a lot more chronic fatigue, erectile dysfunction is common, kidney disease, stiffness of joints, diabetes is very much on the rise as well. Autism, there's a link there, not just from the EMFs, but also linked into heavy metals and other factors as well. So, you know, all these diseases are on the rise, and they're just as a result of the mitochondrial dysfunction. So we can see how wide-ranging and the adverse effects of EMFs are. So what sort of symptoms do people see when they're getting adversely affected by the electromagnetic fields? So most symptoms are due to non-specific stress response, which means they can be caused by other stressors too. And this is one of the reasons why EMFs have perhaps gone undetected for so long, and people don't realize the effect that they're having on their life, and they're blaming the symptoms that they're experiencing on modern life, on stress for jobs, relationships, or whatever else within their life. But because we can't see EMFs, we don't realize that they're there. You know, if we could see them in the same way that we could see smog, then we really would be in a real pea super, which is one of the reasons why EM radiation has often been referred to as electrosmog as well. So skin, obviously, because it's on the surface, is one area where it's very commonly experienced of symptoms. So you can get rashes, itchiness, redness, tingling, burning. Obviously, if it's strong EMFs, you'll get perhaps more the more burning. But certainly rashes and itchiness aren't unusual. Heart, arrhythmias, palpitations, because you know the heart has got an electrical system of its own that is determines and coordinates all the different chambers of the heart for pumping the blood around the body. So it's very much more susceptible because of its requirement to be ongoing all the time. You know, it is very much more susceptible to EMF effects. So brain, we've already talked about how the CNS is one of the main areas which is adversely affected. So we see symptoms of tiredness, poor memory, poor concentration, brain fog, heavy metal toxicity because of the increase in the permeability of the blood-brain barrier. This combined with the heavy metal toxicity can lead to things like autism, and there's been various mechanisms suggested where mercury from mother's filling can get into a fetus's brain prior to birth, and this is one way where babies can be born with autism. We're also seeing headaches, migraines, dizziness, nausea, chronic fatigue. So a lot of these symptoms, you know, we just, they creep up on us, you know, on a slow basis on the whole, and you know, we just put it down to modern living and other reasons. So other areas of the body, we spoke about eyes, so cataracts, infertility, miscarriage, congenital malformations, eye strain, glucose metabolism leading to diabetes, digestive disorders because we can get a leaky gut in the same way that the blood-brain barrier is compromised by electromagnetic fields. So is the digestive tract wall, which leads to leaky gut, and it can set up all sorts of allergies and autoimmune problems as well. We get suppressed immunity because of the effects on the blood, which leads to frequent infections. The effects on the brain cause behavioral disorders, and of course we've already spoken about various different cancers. So symptoms can be local or they can be general. Sometimes people who are electrosensitive and don't realize that they start wearing something like wearable technology, trying to be healthy and monitor their parameters, will suddenly get a rash under their Fitbit or or Apple Watch or wherever else they're wearing can may be caused by the EMFs from that technology. So there's been a number of huge number of papers, and here's just one again by Martin Pohl, which is microwave frequency electromagnetic fields producing widespread neuropsychiatric effects, including depression. Simon Cowell says giving up his mobile phone has made him happier, which sort of backs up this idea that he was getting suppressed and didn't realize maybe that the mobile phone wasn't just because of the frequency which it was ringing that was causing him stress and making him possibly depressed, but actually the EMFs directly from it as well. Professor Tom Butler from Dublin in Ireland, he's written a paper on the clear evidence of the risk to children from non-ionizing radio frequency radiation. So the case of digital technologies in the home, classroom and society. And he points out that industry-funded scientists continue to hold that non-thermal effects do not exist. However, thousands of independent research studies have demonstrated that low-intensity radio frequency radiation elicits a range of pathophysiological conditions in experimental animals and humans, and that we really need to take responsibility as parents, educators and governments for the future generations and work on the preventative theories and ideas to put things in place so that the children are being protected. So electromagnetic hypersensitivity, EHS. Whilst everybody is affected by electromagnetic fields, most people can still function despite the non-specific symptoms. We can cope with tiredness, a bit of brain fog. We forget things and we remember them later, or we don't. Headaches, eye strain, reduced immunity, etc. They don't necessarily stop us functioning totally on a day-to-day basis. They might wear us down. They might make us more susceptible to infections, but we still manage to function to a certain degree. However, an estimated 1.5%, according to Sweden, or 13.3%, which is huge, in Taiwan, of the population suffer from electromagnetic hypersensitivity, which is a much higher level of influence. So these people are debilitated to the point where they cannot function within EMFs and are often forced to live in remote areas away from technology. Obviously, we think of Taiwan as a very techno area. A lot of technology comes from there, and obviously a lot of people are using it. And the more you use it, the more sensitive you become to it. Sweden is just very much more aware of electromagnetic radiation as an issue, and has recognized and is being much more forthright in diagnosing people who suffer from electromagnetic hypersensitivity. So up until now, EHS hasn't been well recognized, except by some doctors. Even the World Health Organization sort of give it lip service, but don't recognize it as an official condition. And obviously the future coverage by satellites, where the whole planet will be accessed or accessible to EMFs and Wi-Fi and the internet through wherever you are. This doesn't really have any consideration for those individuals who suffer from electromagnetic hypersensitivity and have to hide themselves away in remote areas. So it's not really a very considerate situation by covering the whole planet as is planned. So finally, EHS has been confirmed as a disorder in its own right, and this paper has only just been published earlier this year. So it's in the International Journal of Molecular Science in March 2020, so very recently. So electrohypersensitivity is a new identified and characterized neurological pathological disorder. How to diagnose, treat and prevent it. So this work was done in France. So they have identified certain changes in the brain that are consistent with people who suffer from EHS, and they are asking the World Health Organization to recognize EHS as a neurological disorder, which obviously has then huge implications to the responsibilities for the different countries as to how we work with and expose people to electromagnetic radiation. So coming more on to sort of the 5G microwave side of things. So there's an energetic and an informational aspect to them. So conventionally, electromagnetic fields influences have been considered to be energetic only, i.e. it's a linear influence determined by the power level of the field. And you know, it's widely considered that there's a power level, a threshold above which is harmful and below which is safe. But this isn't exactly the full story. So according to a Russian called Kazanatsev, microwave frequencies can have an informational effect on the body that is determined not by the energy of the EMF, but by other characteristics of frequency band modulation, polarization, and duration. So this is coming back to where we've already talked about how research doesn't have modulation, probably isn't polarized, and we aren't looking at long periods of duration either in the research, which is perhaps why this informational aspect on the body has been missed or suppressed. So what this means is that there are frequency windows of effect, i.e. non-linear influences, which means that there is no absolute safety threshold. And if we look back at those two slides with the two different tables of power influence, we can see that even some of the very low power levels, we're getting influences on the body. Informational EMFs within the correct resonant frequency windows require very low power for effect, with a lower boundary of 10 to the minus 16 watts per meter squared, which is just very low. And this is why we can't have, you know, this threshold of absolute safety. It just doesn't work with these resonant frequencies and the informational effects. So informational EMFs influence indigenous EMFs and thus function. So what they're doing is they're affecting maybe protein folding, enzyme activity, or the voltage-gated ion channels. And it is through those effects on those aspects of our indigenous EMFs that control all these different biological functions that we get a much bigger amplification and influence of function. So if we look at Russian millimetre wave research, microwave research, you know, there's a lot made that 5G hasn't been tested for safety, which, you know, by industry, which is very true. But you know, there is research which has been done by the Russians a long time ago, which has proven it to be unsafe, and this is being suppressed and being overlooked. However, a confirmational study was done in 2010, looking at the immunological effects of microwaves. So it was repeating the earlier Russian experiments. And so Soviet studies conducted between 1974 and 1991, so 30 years ago at the closest, that showed immunological and reproductive effects of long-term low-level exposure. So, you know, those are pretty, you know, profound. Our immune system is crucial to how we can resist disease, and obviously reproductive effects. We're seeing a lot of problems in those areas these days. In another paper, which was again published in 1980, Soviet and Eastern European research on biological effects of microwave radiation, which was a summary of a lot of different research papers done by Donald McCree. And within his abstract, he said this literature reports changes in almost all biological systems at exposure power densities less than 10 milliwatts per centimetre squared, which is the upper threshold of what's regarded as safe. So, you know, this research is dating back to the 1970s, showing that microwave radiation is harmful, and yet it's being completely suppressed these days. Here's another Russian paper looking at the biological effects of millimetre microwaves. Okay, so in this paper from 1977, morphological, functional and biochemical studies conducted in humans and animals revealed that millimetre waves cause changes in the body manifested in structural alterations in the skin and internal organs, qualitative and quantitative changes of the blood and bone marrow composition, and changes of the conditioned reflex activity, tissue respiration, activity of enzymes participating in the process of tissue respiration, and nucleic metabolism, which is all fairly fundamental. The degree of unfavourable effects of millimetre waves depends on the duration of the radiation and individual characteristics of the organism. So there is some genetic variation, so some individuals will be more susceptible than others. And, you know, if we're going to be a proper society, then we need to consider those individuals who are more susceptible to EMFs. But the duration of radiation here is, for me, is crucial. You know, these experiments would have been carried out for maybe a relatively short exposure time per day for a number of days, which, you know, when we're going to be exposed 24/7, 365, there is going to be no respite from the radiation, and you know, these individual characteristics of organisms and individual susceptibility is probably going to become less significant as more and more people will be affected by just the duration of the radiation over time. And of course, once the satellites have been put up and the infrastructure is in place and it's all working, then there will be nowhere where we can go to get away from it. So within the paper itself, it went on to say the irradiation inhibited the oxygen consumption by the mitochondria, which we know are the powerhouses of all the cells. And in the liver and kidneys, phosphorylation decreased by 64%. So we're not talking about small changes in cell activity here. These are significant changes in terms of how the body is able to function. And in, you know, major organs, liver and kidneys are, you know, the two main organs of excretion. So if they're not working properly, then we become toxic. If we become toxic, then, you know, everything else starts falling apart. So, you know, these are major effects of millimetre wave radiation, which we are being told now is safe. So the skin interfaces with electromagnetic fields. So the skin is the largest organ in the body. It is integrated with all other body systems and forms part of the homeostatic regulation of the whole body, feeding back to other organs and inputting into regulatory systems. So the idea that just because the skin is on the surface and it's the first defense against electromagnetic fields, and therefore it's somehow a barrier against the rest of the body, is really ignoring the fact that the body as a whole is integrated within itself. It has a homeostatic regulation that takes consideration of all organs in the body, and obviously the skin being the largest, why wouldn't it be putting into the system? And even if you consider that the skin is even if you like to believe that it may be a barrier and it absorbs all this energy, well, you know, surely absorbing all this energy, what's that going to do? It's going to just make us more susceptible to skin pathology. So the skin also contains nerve endings that carry signals deeper into the body. You know, we've got nerves that end in the skin that you know, we detect heat and pressure and all the other types of nerve endings that we have. but they go somewhere. They don't just stay in the skin. These nerves carry signals deeper into the body, into the central nervous system. And the idea that somehow EMFs, if they're affecting the nerves, aren't going to be carried deeper into the body just is quite ridiculous. And we're already seeing some pathological changes of nerves within the skin. We're seeing demyelination of these nerves. So, you know, that in itself isn't good for the skin. We also know that electroacupuncture and electrodermal screening indicate that bioactive points on the skin surface have different electrical properties to the surrounding skin. There was some work done in Korea where they were able to stain the energy channels that lead from the bioactive points deeper into the body, according to the traditional Chinese meridian system. And this is effectively a pathway for EMF influences to travel deeper into the deeper structure of the body, and also to you know, affect the channels associated with certain body organs. And we also see nodular points on the ear. So even just from the ear itself, we can influence other areas of the body. So certain areas of the skin have also been shown to have reflex links to organs and other deeper structures. I mean, it's the whole basis of reflexology, and there's been a number of various different systems worldwide that have made this link between the skin and different areas of the body. You've got Sujok and Dien Chan, two systems of reflexology. We know from effects, you know, if we stay out in the sun too long, the skin absorbs all the UV light, and in the same way, if the millimetre waves from 5G, etc., are hitting the skin and being absorbed more in the skin, then we're more likely to see skin pathology and especially skin cancers as well. So we can see subtle influences can lead to big changes. So protein folding and structure is affected by EMFs. There's a paper by Meyer and Giesink in 2017 where they're looking at the effects of EMFs on protein folding, which obviously protein structure determines how it functions, especially if it's something like an enzyme. So small changes in charge distribution can cause significant morphological changes through protein folding. And if you've got an enzyme which is processing however many million molecules a second, and all of a sudden that enzyme isn't able to function and do that, you can see how that inability to process that many molecules suddenly magnifies the effect of the EMFs much more than you consider as possible just from the charge and the fields from the EMF itself. There's also been a relatively recent discovery that human skin behaves like a MEM resistor, which is a sort of type of electronic component. So as it's a device that remembers the last current experience and varies its resistance accordingly. So when a negative electrical potential is applied to skin, creates a current, the skin exhibits a lowered resistance to subsequent current flowing through the skin. So this means the longer the skin is exposed to a negative potential, the lower the subsequent resistance and the deeper future EMFs will be allowed to penetrate. And obviously the deeper they can penetrate, the more they will influence things like the nerves and the blood vessels within the skin, and also the bioactive points as well. And also the closer that the skin is being affected, close to its germinative layer, which is where, you know, we're going to get more problems with cancer and problems with the skin pathology. So we also see amplification effects on EMFs. So sweat glands act as an antenna to sub-terahertz frequencies, preferentially absorbing radiation in this window, especially when sweating. So when there's water in the sweat glands and the fact that they're coiled, they act like an antenna and they absorb this energy. And of course, when energy is absorbed, then it has a greater effect on the DNA and everything else that we've already been talking about. So skin capillaries, they carry blood with indirect influence of the microwaves. So they expose the blood cell membranes, so that's red and white blood cells, and the DNA of the white blood cells to damage. So we're having a potentially direct effect on the immune system through the white blood cells, but also potentially if we're damaging the cell membranes of red blood cells, then we're affecting the ability of red blood cells to carry oxygen. We also see red blood cell clumping together, forming rouleau. And this is also linked to the fourth phase water effect, disruption that happens in capillaries as well. So there's also another effect which is called the Brie-1 precursor effect. When information is transmitted at more than 10 gigabytes per second, and some of the 5G predictions we're talking about up to 20 gigabytes per second, so double this speed or double this amount, this induces formation of deeper currents, and the majority of the power of this signal is transferred into these induced currents. And of course, the deeper they are, then obviously they will have greater biological influences as well. There's also things called domain coherence and entanglement, so which is sort of looking at quantum physics, where changes in cells and ions at the surface will be mirrored by the exact same structures in cells and identical ion channels deeper in the body. So these are real effects. Quantum physics isn't just theoretical. This entanglement and domain coherence is real. We see it in nature when shoals of fish all seem to swim in unison in one as if they're one organism, and likewise you see birds in the skies at night when they're chasing all the insects. They flow in these great big fly in these great big flocks, and it flows. It looks like that they're changing direction in very close formation. They don't bump into each other, and this is all linked to domain coherence and entanglement effects. So this is what happens with EMFs in the blood. This is this here. We've got healthy blood without EMF exposure. We've got nice, distinct red blood cells, and then if we expose the blood to Wi-Fi for a period of time, then a short period of time, you get these rouleaux. You can see these stacks here of red blood cells, and over time you'll get other effects. So in this blood picture here, you've also got fungal formation from candida, systemic candida, and there's reasons why the EMFs will help to promote pathogen and mold and fungal growth at the same time. So the more blood is exposed on a continual basis, the more common this blood picture will look, which, as you can see, is hugely different to the healthy blood. We can also see indirect EMF effects. So we get facilitation of secondary adverse influences such as pollution, solvents, agrochemicals, e.g. glyphosate, heavy metals. We get increased leaky gut and blood-brain barrier, etc. So, EMFs affect the body and will facilitate other influences on the body which will have an adverse effect on us, creating a cumulative synergistic adverse event. Now, Russian research from 1995 demonstrated that water, which has been pre-irradiated with microwave frequencies, has the same effect on voltage-gated calcium channels as the EMFs themselves. So this has quite a profound implication for how the body can be affected by microwave frequencies indirectly. So if drinking water is exposed to microwaves, this will then pick up the same effects as they found in this Russian experiment. And if we then drink it, we will have the effects on the voltage-gated calcium channels and that whole chain of reaction that causes reactive oxygen species damage and free radical damage and all the pathology that goes as a result from that. Obviously, as blood passes through the skin capillaries, they will be exposed to the microwave frequencies, and the water, obviously quite a high aspect, a high content of blood, will impart the informational aspects from the EMFs throughout the body as it circulates round. Plus, of course, obviously we get the direct damage to blood cells from the microwaves as they're on the skin surface as well. Now, we also effects on implants. So, pacemakers, defibrillators, cochlear implants, dental implants, including this includes fillings with the old amalgam, the mercury. It can leach mercury into the blood, and obviously if the blood-brain barrier, as we've already spoken about here, is becoming more leaky, and this allows the heavy metals to get into the brain, which has been implicated for things like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. So maybe the reason why the older generation, a lot of whom have still got amalgam fillings, are seeing a higher incidence of some of these neurodegenerative disorders. But also, pins and plates from bone breakages and fractures, etc. These will act as antennae and pick up the EMFs and cause effects, maybe more so in the bones that are creating or that have got these pins in them, in the bone marrow, etc. What about long-term effects from food storage, which are exposed to microwaves? Obviously, the power is very low, but we know microwaves, ovens can cook food, and we also know that effects from EMFs is a function of frequency, power level, and exposure. So when we've got much lower power levels from EMFs compared to what you see in a microwave oven, that you've got considerably longer exposure times, then there are going to be effects on the food. So what effect is that going to have on the food? Is it going to change how long it's viable for storage? But also what happens when we eat this food? We've already seen from here that water pre-irradiated with microwave frequencies can have the same effect on the voltage-gated calcium channels. So obviously water has got a high, or food has got a high water content. So when we eat this food, which has likewise been exposed to these microwaves, then there's no reason to expect that this food won't have a similar effect at a deeper level than the microwaves themselves. There's an interesting experiment, if you want to call it that way, which was conducted in Moscow. The US embassy there was irradiated with microwave frequencies from 1953 to 1976. And this is taken from a declassified and approved document that was released from the CIA, and it came from, I think it's 15th of April 1976 is the date we can just about make out there. So what they discovered was microwave radiation is particularly dangerous to persons who've implanted heart pacemakers. Well, I don't know exactly the number of people who are walking around with heart pacemakers and other implants these days, but clearly, these aren't infrequent. So if microwaves are going to be particularly dangerous to these people, as is being found from this observation back in 1976, then there's an awful lot of people who are going to have a lot of problems when they're in high density 5G situations with all the microwaves flying around the place, especially when we got things like beam forming and phased array, where there'll be beams of 5G following individuals. So what happens if a beam of 5G is following someone's phone somebody with a pacemaker crosses that beam and it focuses on their heart pacemaker, you know, is that person going to suddenly have a crisis and have a heart attack? Or, you know, nobody really knows. As it said in 1976, beyond those with pacemakers, microwave radiation can be deleterious to anyone's health if the exposure is significant enough. Well, you know, here they were talking about a specific embassy, a building on its own being irradiated with microwave frequencies. You know, yet roll forward to now, and we're talking about the whole world being exposed continuously to microwaves. You know, it just beggars belief that anybody can try and make out that this is safe. You know, this research is dating back to the 1970s. We've known about it for over 40 years. And to say that there is no harm whatsoever is clearly lying. There's no other way to express it, really, because when these papers were being written, there was no expectation that 5G was just around the corner. They had nothing to hide, so they said everything, and we've got to take it on face value. There are so many of these papers now that there is no doubt that microwaves on a continuous basis, on the level which is being predicted, will have mass harm to the human population and the animal population as well, to our pets, to the wildlife, to the environment. It's just, as Professor Martin Paul said, utter madness. I said here, the exposure will be 24/7, 365. You know, there is no respite, or there will be no respite. Okay, so if we look at this graph here, we've got some important resonant frequencies. So we've got a resonant frequency of water, which is 22 gigahertz, which is just below the high band 5G frequency, which is sort of be 24 to 28 gigahertz. 60 gigahertz is also going to be used a lot within the future 5G, and it's the resonant frequency of oxygen, diatomic oxygen, which means that these oxygen molecules will absorb a lot of the power from this 60 gigahertz microwaves, and this is unregulated. So it means that anybody who wants to use microwave telecommunication signal but doesn't want to have a license and pay for a license will use this unregulated, unlicensed 60 gigahertz frequency. So it's going to be in use a hell of a lot, and we really have no idea what mass use of this 60 gigahertz frequency is going to do to diatomic oxygen. There's another peak here at 118 gigahertz, and water has another peak here at 183 gigahertz. So we've just spoken about these resonant frequencies here. So yeah, Y-gig, we can already buy tri-band Y-gig routers where 60 gigahertz is already built into the circuitry. So we're already talking about broadcasting 60 gigahertz around the home without having any idea what it's going to do long term on oxygen. So we've got human, atmospheric, human, animal and plant repercussions are unknown because it's been unstudied, it hasn't been studied. So is oxygen binding to hemoglobin affected? There have been various theories put forward saying that oxygen which has been irradiated by 60 gigahertz will be affected and will make it more difficult to bind to hemoglobin. That may be true, but the truth is we don't know. Nobody has done the research to prove whether this happens or it doesn't happen. But if it does happen, what are we letting ourselves in for? Of course, there are environmental effects of EMFs as well. With around 53,000 satellites planned by 2027, all dedicated to high-power 5G, what will these microwaves do to our ionosphere, to the Van Allen belts, to the ozone layer, to our weather systems, human resonances, and thus our brain activity behaviour? We know that Schumann resonances and brain activity are closely linked, and behavior as a result. And this gets worse with increased delta waves, and delta waves increase when we've got more bad weather. So if we're affecting the ionosphere, then we could potentially be getting a lot more activity of discharges of lightning, which is one of these effects that causes increased delta waves. And we also know from work that's been done with telecommunications, looking at how the ionosphere can be used to bounce these telecommunications around the world. We know that it is quite susceptible and will respond to the frequencies. We already know that it changes at the weekend compared to week because of the reduction in power usage at weekends when people aren't at work. So we know that the ionosphere is sensitive to the electromagnetic radiation that we're already putting out. And all of a sudden we're going to put 53,000 satellites up there when we've currently only got about 1,500 in function now. You know, we have no idea how this is going to affect all these different aspects of our environment and ultimately us and our behavior and everything that goes with it. Insects are much more adversely affected by microwaves, as this approximates to their body dimensions. As we know, insects are pollinators and perform other important functions in our ecosystem. So, but insects also feed birds, and many reptiles, fish, and an emerging protein source for people. So these microwaves can, by adversely affecting insects, can have a huge effect on how our planet functions. We know plants are harmed too. There's even a suggestion that plants may be even more susceptible to microwaves than people. You know, so we're looking at, especially along with the pollinator effects, you know, what is going to happen to our future food supply. So wildlife research has identified adverse effects on birds, which affects them from, you know, the migratory birds to infertility and behavioral changes. There was one research paper where they showed birds nesting within 200 meters of a tetramask were unable to raise any offspring whatsoever, so zero fertility effectively. And it was also noted that birds which are in couples seem to bicker. So the behavioral changes, inability to make proper functioning nests. So we know that wildlife is significantly adversely affected by EMFs. Birds have a piezoelectric effect, which means that their feathers will transmit the EMFs deeper into their body cavities as well. So birds are even more affected by the EMFs than mammals. We're also realizing that our microbiome is hugely important. If we look at the number of our cells of our whole organism, only 10% are human. The rest is our microbiome, which is the bacteria, the viruses, the fungi and the molds which live on us and in us, which communicate within themselves. They have their own homeostasis, which determines our homeostasis and our health. They're hugely responsible for our influence of immune function. And we also know that bacteria and molds respond to EMFs. So, you know, we can get a dysbiosis, which through exposure to EMFs, which will affect how we function. And we also know that mycotoxins are produced 600 times more in EMF fields, which you know, is, I think it's a huge factor in sick building syndrome, and that's often blamed on air quality and molds. But you know, it's not recognised that the reason why these molds and mycotoxins are much higher levels is because the EMFs within the environment. So our microbiome composition directly influences our health. We know that microbiome of the gut influences our brain, influences our mental health. So we're already seeing mental health problems, more of a problem in people as well. Is this due to the EMS we've already seen rising? And we know they're already a quintillion times more than they were previously. So, people aren't making this link between EMF's microbiome and our own health through these environmental and indirect effects. And I think, we need to be far more conscious of how EMFs can affect us and our environment if we want to stay safe and healthy. So as a summary, we are electromagnetic beings. We've already spoken about how cells have an electrical potential, how nerves function on electromagnetic parameters, and the energy flows within this from the bioactive points. So we know all EMFs influence us. So natural EMFs are mostly beneficial, but in some excess can cause harm. Obviously, some natural EMFs can cause harm even when they're not in excess. Some of the natural radiation in certain areas can cause harm, but even the EMFs that are beneficial to us can cause harm in excess. Artificial EMF exposure at certain frequencies for a short determined time can be beneficial, but can cause harm with continual low-level exposure. And it is this low-level exposure at power levels well below thermal effects, which are well documented now. I think the science is fixed. There is no doubt that we get biological effects without thermal influences, and we need to stop pretending that they don't. We know these artificial EMFs can cause harm directly in at least 8 proven ways, but we can cause harm indirectly in so many other ways and through harming our environment and our ecology too. So whilst no safety research has been performed on 5G, there is much evidence from the Russian research especially, and from other research in other countries too, that microwaves can cause harm both directly and indirectly with prolonged exposure. And that, for me, is one of the key phrases: prolonged exposure. We aren't just talking about a little bit here and there. We are talking 24/7, 365. This is an experiment that we can't afford to enter into without having considerably more data, even on top of what we already know is suggesting that the harm is caused. We cannot afford to increase these exposures without looking very much more closely at the safety aspects. As a result of this, I fear that electrohypersensitivity is likely to increase in incidence considerably. We know that the more people are exposed to something which has the potential to cause hypersensitivity, that more and more people will respond to it and will start displaying these symptoms. And instead of relatively low percentages within the population having these problems, this will rise significantly. And unfortunately, even in those individuals who get it, there is nowhere now, or there will be nowhere once all the satellites up and once we've got masts and antennae every 50 to 100 meters in cities. Where are these people supposed to go to get respite and be able to live a meaningful life without being adversely influenced and harmed by the electromagnetic radiation? Okay, so that's it. That's the PowerPoint presentation. I hope you found it useful. I hope you found it informative. Please like the video and share it around, and look out for the next video we're going to be doing, which will be looking at some of these aspects in perhaps a little bit more detail, and maybe looking at how we can mitigate for some of the effects of EMFs as well. Thank you for watching.